Hello and welcome to the Current Perspective lecture series presented by the Kansas City Art Institute. My name is Tom Lewis and I co-chair photography and filmmaking here at the school. Tonight, we are very excited to welcome Amir Zaki as our guest speaker. Amir Zaki is a Southern California artist working primarily in photography. Amir has a national and international reputation, is widely published, exhibits frequently, and has been included in museum collections such as the Whitney Museum of American Art, the New Museum of Contemporary Art, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the UCLA Hammer Museum, amongst many others. He has recently been included in Photography is Magic, a publication by Charlotte Cotton, and has his own publication exploring Southern California skate parks. Most of Amir's work seems to revolve around architectural and organic aspects of the landscape in Southern California. His key interests lie in the rhetoric and authenticity of a photographic image, and he uses these things to great effect in his interrogation of the medium. I hope you will join me in welcoming Amir to tonight's presentation, and I thank you all for attending.
Okay, so thanks everybody for the invitation. I'm going to do something a little bit different this evening with this lecture. I'm going to spend a little bit of time, hopefully not too long, getting derailed, talking about a little bit of personal history and a little bit of context of kind of where I came from and how I became an artist, I guess. And then I'll be slightly brief. I have to edit down 20 years worth of work into 45 minutes or so. So I'll be skipping entire bodies of work, but hopefully that will be okay. So I was told that the full screen is working, so hopefully you see this in full screen. So these are my parents in around 1962. I was born in 1974. This is soon after they met. My dad immigrated here from Egypt as a young man to study in college. And my mother lived in Minnesota. That's where they met. Her family lived there for several generations, and she has European ancestry. So this is my folks soon after they met. These are my grandparents on my dad's side and my sister when she was first born. And these are my grandparents on my mother's side in Minnesota and this was at my parents' wedding. This is my brother and my sister and I. Those little amazing booties I'm wearing, my mom must have sewed with the little green pom-poms on them. This is one of our many camping trips we would take. This is in Joshua Tree, which is, I'm going to show a little map of where I'm from for this audience from the Midwest, and I'm in Southern California. So this is in Southern California, common destination. So that's the new part. I do always start my slide lectures with this image. So the picture on the left is the house I was born into and grew up in Beaumont, California. And that picture was taken in 1972, a couple of years before I was born. It was given to my parents when they bought the house. And the photograph on the right, I continuously update every year or so of the same view to show a sort of indication of my age as symbolized by this palm tree that is a kind of constant in that yard. And I also show it because of the relationship between nature and architecture, which is a central theme in my work. Um, the house I grew up in is somewhat unusual. This is great. This is probably right around when I was born. That's my brother, who's about 8 years older than me. um, the house we grew up in is unusual in the neighborhood because it's a ranch style home, and it's actually sort of, if you think about it, it doesn't have a front door. It has three sort of side doors that you don't see from the street, and it was fairly flat roofed and um, weird. We would have people come to the house and knock on the first door, and we'd say we weren't interested, and they would go to the next door thinking it was a different house. Um, and that was a source of entertainment. This is a fairly recent picture of my mom waving goodbye. So what I show this picture is I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'll just describe that structure on the right in the back there was built on afterwards. This is it. And this was a bedroom that my parents built on when I was a teenager, and it became my space. Basically, I spent from about age 15 to 20 or so in this room. So my formative teenage years in complete independence, meaning that it was not attached to the house. I had friends over, we had parties, we had a band, and they built this very strange staircase that leads up to a roof with no railing, where I also spent quite a bit of time with friends and, doing what you do as a teenager. This is a rare image of snow last year in the neighborhood. So I show all these things to sort of describe how I guess I was formed by the architectural landscape around me. I also want to show this, which I kind of came across today. It's kind of great. I'm zooming in so you can see where I practiced this a few times here. Come on. There it is. Okay, so here's Beaumont in Southern California. And here's my street. Sorry. There's my house. I like how Google renders this. There we go. So I show this too because this neighborhood is pretty old, and the way it looks now is very much the way it looked growing up. This shitty street is where I spent my childhood with friends, skateboarding around and exploring and being completely free compared to standards that children live in today. When it rained, this area would flood, and we'd race little boats. But this landscape is what I grew up in. And I think that, in some ways it definitely informed how I think about a kind of sense of alienation and my interest in both the natural and the built landscape. So with that said, I'll actually talk about some work. That's my long intro. So I titled this lecture Building and Becoming, which is actually something I'm thinking about for a book I want to make, which has a kind of duality to it in terms of thinking about my work as being divided into the built landscape and the natural landscape, and really kind of where those two things those lines get blurred. I'm gonna blast through some very early work just to have you look at it because I don't have time to talk about it, and start a little more recently. This is the first body of work I made after graduate school in 1999. All photographs from high buildings in Los Angeles looking down into mostly the urban landscape, shot at night with a 4x5 camera. Let me move this and go into full screen. And I'll also go briefly through this body of work. So this is called Valley Lake Hollywood Village. These are, you can see the scale, these are about 2 by 6 foot tall photographs. They're basically body size. And they're, in essence, fictions. They're constructed using software, using Photoshop basically, and built from real photographs of homes, but constructed in a way that makes them appear to be very tall and skinny, sort of like mausoleums that you might come across in Europe. And I had this kind of idea in my mind of these suburban-looking mausoleum-like structures. They were inspired by kind of a trip I took to Europe. But again, it's like what I'm looking at in the landscape is trying to look at things that are mostly banal, things that are accessible by anyone who lives in the area. I often work very close to home or within driving distance from home, but try to find ways to create images that seem somewhat alien, which in a lot of ways is what growing up in suburbia can be like. So I'll spend a little bit more time with this body of work. This is 2005, called Spring Through Winter. There are 3 subsets of photographs within this series of work. I often think about my work in terms of both serial, I work in a serial fashion, and I'll often combine several series or sub-series within one body of work conceptually. So this is maybe the first time I really did that consciously, and I've continued that into the present. So the 3 types of images were photographs of these extremely cantilevered homes in a portion of Los Angeles, along with shot from below, and then photographs shot from above of swimming pools. So there's this, again, lots of times in the work, there's a kind of duality that I'm asking the viewer to consider. And in the third part of this work, there are interior photographs of fireplaces. So this is the first, maybe the second body of work that I really was exploring digital technology. I'll just briefly say that my generation of people studying the medium were right at the cusp of the transition between analog and digital. So I learned all analog processes. That was what I fell in love with photography as an undergraduate. I was very young. I was 18, 19, and I learned all that technology. And I'm kind of a tech nerd, so I really love all that stuff, darkroom printing and things. And then Photoshop kind of became accessible, and I embraced that just as fully. So I really am kind of 100% hybrid in my approach, and my kind of my interest in both those technologies is equal. So I use the things that are analog. So I shot all this stuff on a 4x5 camera. I was drum scanning them, and then I was doing a lot of digital manipulation. But throughout the work, what I'm doing digitally is hidden in the sense that it's not about fantasy. So I want the work to look like one would come across something very strange. So in fact, this work was quite a surprise. When I first started making these, I thought people would think they were just ridiculous. But I had architects come up to me and say, "Wow, where are these shots?" So just to cut the mystery out here, these homes look exactly like this and are extremely cantilevered on the landscape. The only thing is that there are three very large pillars that run from about, somewhere about a third of the way from the edge down into the earth. And so using Photoshop, I removed the pillars, and that's all I did. So there was a kind of subtlety in a way to the gesture that really transformed the image. Like it was just enough to make these things seem really, I mean, they're already strange looking, but really strange looking. So the story of how I got access to these places is a little bit of a fun story. So it was before Google Maps, and so I figured out where they were, and I went and I put letters in everybody's mailbox. There's 12 homes in this street. I put letters in everybody's mailbox telling them what I wanted to do, and I needed access to essentially their property. And some people said no, and some people called me and said yes, and some people just didn't respond. But what was good about it is, in this picture, for instance, the person who owned the house on the right said yes, and the person on the left didn't respond. So I was able to access other adjacent yards. So the second part of this body of work involved renting what's called a personal man lift, which is essentially a telescoping device to get access to 30 feet up, so I could make these photographs looking down into swimming pools. A lot of what I was thinking about at this time had to do with thinking about photographing the architectural world in a sculptural way. And what I mean by that is thinking about what's the most interesting way that I can consider this volume. And in terms of the cantilevered houses, it seemed like a no-brainer. It was sort of to photograph them from underneath. There's this way that you can look at the underbelly of this thing from a non-idealistic way. These are very, they were originally designed by the architect Richard Neutra, very well respected modernist design, but they kind of got bastardized over time and restuccoed, and I just really loved all of the stuff that you see from underneath. And then the swimming pools were sort of the inverse of that. It was like thinking about someone like Ed Ruscha's photographs of swimming pools, and even though I'm an enormous Ed Ruscha fan, sort of thinking that those photographs, like that wasn't the best way to photograph a swimming pool in a way, like somehow being at eye level just didn't consider the volume. And this work will come back in my most recent work in a way. This is all from 2005, 4 and 5. The third sub-series in this work were fireplaces that were basically boarded up. That's the best way I can put it, rocked over. And this was all done in Photoshop. I had a little bit of a fantasy when I was making this work, thinking about the fact that fireplaces in Southern California are not often very used because of the climate, and that they could kind of exist more like, more like a tomb or a sculpture within a house. And so I treated them as such. So there's a kind of an exterior view from above, an exterior view from below, and an interior view. And it was I tried to kind of create this idea that these were all similar places, but they're all very different places. None of the homes had swimming pools. None of these fireplaces existed in those homes, but it was a kind of about of a domestic space. This is an installation at the Mack Center Schindler House. I'll go through these installations quickly just so you can see how I'm dealing with scale. I'm actually going to skip over this body of work for time's sake. Sorry, you get to look at it. And of course, during the question and answer, if something comes out and I really, that's usually my favorite part of these talks is actually answering questions. So, so there's a kind of transition that I make around this time, 2007, where I'm thinking about what I guess in quotes, I'll say the natural landscape and how that figures in my work. So I made these images, these black and white images. It's the first time I'd made black and white work in quite a long time, of these things, these trees that were, to me, this is the kind of conceptual part of this work that was very intriguing to me, is these things that existed in a strange place between a stump and a tree, you know, like this sort of liminal space between life and death, and what that looks like in a tree. And so they both are a combination of stumps that I found as is, and then trees that I photographed, and then through Photoshop would transform them into these kind of monstrosities that were in that in-between space. The title of the body of work at what point is the wax no longer wax, comes from a Descartes meditation where he describes wax in its solid state and in its liquid state, and how every property of the wax changes, yet we still know it's wax. And it's just a really beautiful metaphor, and I was just kind of thinking about that while I was making this. So like this image, this is a prop that I rented from like a Hollywood set, you know, and I was sort of trying to ride this line between artificiality and the natural. So I feel like I'm going speed version of this, but I'll give you your money's worth, your free money's worth. Try to show you as much as I can. So this is a body of work in 2010 called Relics. It was a fairly singular series of lifeguard towers that were all in California, with the exception of this diptych of 2 Volkswagen Vanagons. This was shot over maybe a year or so. This is the first one I made, and it's a good one to talk about the process for the body of work, and maybe the inspiration, I would say, for the body of work, which is that, you know, around 2006, I moved from Los Angeles to a town called Huntington Beach, which is in Southern California near the ocean. And the landscape was really different. I was actually struggling quite a bit to try to find subjects to photograph. And one day during the winter, this thing sort of showed up on the sand, not really in place, but kind of off to the side, and didn't have any stickers on it or any marking. And it was so alien looking. It was all fiberglass and looked like a computer designed it. And it looked like nothing like any lifeguard tower, like something like this that I grew up looking at on the beach. And I immediately wanted to photograph it. It was so sculptural and strange and boarded up. So it's like it has this element of being dysfunctional. And that's another theme that comes in and out of my work, which is, you know, sort of highlighting the dysfunctional quality of something, or emphasizing this idea of, like, the lifeguard tower is intended to be this very open, protective, you know, beacon, and in these cases it's boarded up, it's closed. And the other thing that I'm doing is I'm removing any access. So there's almost always some kind of ladder or way to get to this thing. So I remove the access, and I also am reducing and really altering the way it's propped up. So it's kind of a little more precarious than normal. And I did a large body of work of these, all different kinds that I would find, and all different degrees of, I will say, some sort of alterations. Uh, more often than not, it may be changing a little bit more recently, but more often than not, the point of view that I'm in my photographs is really important. This actually goes back, I would say, maybe psychologically, to growing up where I did, and spending time, you know, contemplating the world around me from being up on a rooftop of my suburban, neighborhood, and bored out of my mind, or drinking beer with friends, and so so a lot of my work emphasizes being in a position with my body that's not the sort of standard standing looking out at the world. It's high up above, down below, something that would find you in a somewhat unstable or unusual position. So that's repeated in lots of different instances in the work, and these were no exception. So what I had to do in all the other lifeguard towers that had signage is, of course, I removed any signage. I didn't want any kind of text or anything that located this thing as a specific thing in a specific place. It's much more about the kind of iconographic quality of them. And the other thing I'll say about this is that a lot of them have skies that I started collecting photographs of skies and lifeguard towers, and I would sort of marry them in a way that would be almost like a portrait photographer, choosing a backdrop for a particular person. So this is one of the exceptions where it's actually, wow, that is so weird. I have no clue why that's crooked. Whoa, that's very strange. It's not supposed to be crooked, but that is the natural background for that lifeguard tower, believe it or not. In the same body of work, I was thinking a lot about my autobiography, and this is a kind of one of the more particularly autobiographical pieces. The van on the left, which is blue, is a kind of recreation that I made. I owned a van like that in high school that was totaled by a drunk driver 2 weeks after I graduated, in a kind of traumatic way, and I lost it. It was gone, and years went by, and I found, when these weren't popular at all in the early 2000s, I found a van that was gray and got it, and afterwards had it painted the other choice of colors from the same year, which was 1982, which was this kind of two-tone orange. And I love the kind of yin-yang quality of these things. And I made this diptych that was about sunsets and moon rises, and moonsets and sunrises, and thinking about the East Coast and the West Coast, and how the sun sets on the West Coast but rises on the East. And all these things were going on in my mind when I made this piece. So basically, I drove my orange van into a parking lot, photographed it, turned it around and moved it a little bit and photographed it again, and then recreated my blue van from my orange van. So in 2013, I moved to a body of work that was black and white again, and I also changed processes a lot. This is actually a really important shift that isn't visible, but may be helpful to talk about. Up until this body of work, I was shooting with a 4x5 camera, analog, film, and scanning the images. I was also, which you can't see in here because I fixed the images on the computer, I also was using, glazing these things with plexiglass, and they were terribly reflective and really kind of depressing because I spent so much time making these things, and then I'd make a large one, and all I would see is reflection. So two major shifts happened in my work from then until 2013, which is I changed technologies to a digital technology that I'll talk about, which has conceptual implications, and it really changed the way I thought about my work and how to make work. And I also stopped using any glass. So these photographs from this point forward are all shown with just a protective spray on them and no glass, no glazing. So this body of work is called Time Moves Still. This is an exhibition in Los Angeles at a gallery that doesn't exist anymore called Acme. So this is probably a good one to describe the process. So film was becoming more and more expensive, technology was changing, and one thing that kept me from moving to digital technology was that the quality of the sensor and the quality of the cameras just didn't come close to being as good as analog. But around this time, there's a piece of technology called the GigaPan, which is a robotic tripod head. Actually, it's right behind me, but a robotic tripod head that you attach a digital camera to, and it basically makes rows and columns of pictures, individual high-resolution digital pictures, and then you stitch them together in Photoshop later or with software. And what it allows you to do is to create a really incredibly high-resolution image, much more information than you would get with a 4x5 or even an 8x10 if done right, but has lots of strange challenges and lots of really amazing benefits. So in a picture like this is probably made of 50 individual pictures, moving across rows and columns as you move down. But what it allows you to do is refocus. So this is something very strange to the way it looks, is that I'm actually focusing, at 300 feet away or whatever that is at the top of this cliff. And every row, I just keep focusing as I get closer. And up until where I'm focusing, looking almost down at these rocks that are maybe 15 feet in front of me. So it allows you to photograph an incredibly wide view from very close up. But because every individual picture is telephoto, there's a sort of compression of space. So you get a wide point of view and a telephoto point of view in one image. And it's not something you notice right away, but if you look at a picture like this, I'm standing on the coast, normally to get this view, I would probably have to be, a couple hundred feet in the water to make a picture like this. The other thing that's changing is time. So a picture like this might take 10 or 15 minutes to make. The sun can come in and out of clouds. You'll get elements of a picture that has shadow because the sun is showing. You'll get elements of the picture that are overcast, and it kind of blends it all together in this very strange, subtly fictional way that I love about it. It's kind of like a long, extended moment in time that appears to be one brief moment. So I made a series of these in an ideological sense. That's a fun one. I'll go back to that maybe. In a sense, basically, one of the things I was very interested in this body of work was that that these are all elaborate access points of access for the person who lives at the top of this hill, who overlooks the ocean, that they build, that they of course have to bring up so that strangers can't use it. But the whole point of view of this coastal living is the view of the ocean. So when I was making these pictures, I got a lot of really funny looks because I'm standing with my back facing the view, and I'm really interested in this view, and people would be jogging or walking by and sort of look at me and look at where I'm photographing and have this kind of perplexed look on their face about why I'm photographing the wrong view. But of course, for me, that's often the right view. I was super interested in the way that both the kind of natural erosion of the landscape was kind of slowly like blending in or overcoming, or there was a kind of blur between what's built and what's natural. You know, this fence is kind of following the landscape, and then the brush is growing over the fence, and the sort of textural quality of all this was really fascinating for me. So in the same body of work, I had these also gigapan photographs, these kind of composite of trees. And this is an ongoing project in some ways. I kind of returned to making photographs of trees as time goes on. And for me, the interest in these trees was, again, trying to figure out a way to photograph something that I thought was banal. You know, they're everywhere, but in an unusual way. And let me see if I can find a good example. Well, actually, this one is good. So in all of these, I'm basically finding myself nearly underneath the tree, looking up and making this array of many, many images. And so if the wind was blowing, you know, there may be portions of the image that are blurry and portions that are not. There may be a bird that flies in for the moment that I'm photographing that section. And again, there's a kind of sense of an elongated sense of time with these. These varied in scale from very small, like 8 by 10 inches, to 5 by 6 feet or larger. So the only rule I gave myself when I made these pictures was that I would never photograph a tree that looked like it was intentionally manicured to look nice. So it was more like a sense of kind of rescuing these trees from being overlooked. So I would seek out trees that had some sense of personality, but definitely didn't look like they were cut by anybody with skill to look good. So this one that's just completely butchered back was really attractive for me. This is a very large photograph. It's maybe 7 feet tall or so. So I can't tell if anybody can see where my little mouse is, but there's a little bird in this picture, and that little insignificant bird becomes somewhat important in more recent work. So Tom, I'm about 20 minutes. It's 5:40, and I have a couple more bodies of work. Can you give me a sense of where I am with time?
Just keep going. You'll be fine.
Okay. I'm going to skip this body of work. I got not a lot, but I have a couple more that I really want to spend some time with. Yeah, that's better. So I'm moving to 2016. Another body of work that is black and white. And this is a kind of significant shift in that there's a use of both traditional photographic processes and 3D modeling processes, completely digital, which is something I kind of was self-taught in around 2010 for another project that I didn't show, but came into this body of work in a really significant way. There are 2 sub-series of images of very large rock outcroppings that exist along the California coast that I photographed for over a year, just different parts of the coast from north to south. And then these wooden carvings, which I will explain a little bit of detail how they were made, interspersed together and kind of really intended to be thought of as seamlessly coexisting, but made in very, very different ways. So get to the individual pictures. So the rocks are discovered from scouting and Google Earth and all sorts of things that I would find. And again, these are photographed with the same technology, made up of many, many different images, individual images. And because they're black and white, and because they are so sort of strange when isolated from the rest of the landscape, there's a kind of sense that they seem somewhat artificial or, again, somewhat alien. There's also something that happens where the scale of the rocks is really confusing. So there are sometimes tiny little indicators, like a bird that will be in the image, or some of these were actually used for climbing, and there'll be like a carabiner that you can see, and then suddenly you just are sort of, you start to understand the scale of this thing that you're looking at. But I really like this, the fact that they kind of may look like miniatures or like scholars' rocks, Chinese scholars' rocks or something. And that's that shift of scale, or the ambiguity of scale, is very important. And along with these, and otherwise, there's very little alteration done to these images. But with them are these things I called carvings. And so these are made in a very different way. So these rock formations were made over, millennia. Their shapes and forms were basically carved or etched with tides and the earth's movement. And there's something tectonic about it, and something slow, and something just kind of timeless about, a formation like this, right? And then these are made in such a different way, but in a way that kind of have a relationship. So the best way I can explain the way I made these is that in 3D software, you can create a kind of cloth, something that acts like a cloth in physics. So if you drop a cloth in the air, it flows and moves by the wind and forces. And if you froze that by taking a snapshot of it at any particular moment, it would have a shape. I would do that, and then I would take that shape and give it volume. And then I was making very large, high resolution photographs of wood veneers. So I would 4 by 8 foot sheets. I would buy these wood veneers and photograph them. So I had this incredibly high resolution texture that I then wrapped around these wooden forms that I was making in 3D software, and then light them in such a way, again, all virtually. So the idea I had in putting them together was that there's a kind of blurring of both fictional or natural and an artificiality. Like, these things are made by a computer program in an instant with an algorithm, versus the rocks, which take, like I said, thousands of years to form, and putting those things in the same place together. I thought of these things as maybe something like a piece of driftwood that you might find that was just formed in some really incredible way. There's also an ambiguity of scale with these. And then in installation views, just very briefly, the scale, there's a scale shift between all the work, where sometimes the carvings are very small and the rocks are very big, and sometimes the rocks are big. And so as you look through the installation, there's even more of a kind of confusion in terms of what is it that you're looking at. So I'm going to just show you a couple of these incredibly, I guess I got tired of black and white for a little bit, and in 2018 I made these photographs of pairings of trees shot at night with that same process, but with like a flat, just a gigantic light source that kind of followed them around. And I would combine these pairings of trees shot in different locations at different days as a kind of like a couple. And they have titles that are probably the most poetic titles that I have, like this is called Parent and Child, and this is called The Philosophers. So I was just thinking about relationships between people, best friends or siblings and thinking about the kind of messiness and the beauty of between those kinds of relationships. Okay, so I'm gonna to end with the most recent body of work, and hopefully still have time for questions and things like that. In 2019, I had an exhibition called Empty Vessel, combining two kind of sets of photographs of skate parks, all in California, that were photographed at dawn. I often photograph at that time of day, empty, and combined with photographs of broken ceramics. So I'll sort of talk about them separately and try to talk about why they would be in the same place at the same time. So I started the body of work with these images of skate parks, and it's a project that I actually started maybe 5 years ago, but then gave up on because I couldn't quite figure out how to do it. And I'll say that I grew up skateboarding, and so when I showed you that crappy street that I grew up on, you know, that's what we had to skateboard on. It's kind of the period of time when I would say it was in a kind of heyday in the early 1980s, and I never really skated anything like this until I was in my middle age, my 30s or something. And I love the forms of these. I feel like I relate to them. And when I finally figured out that I could get access to these places very early in the morning when nobody was using them, and I could actually explore them like someone who was walking through a landscape, it opened up the whole project for me and allowed me to kind of see the potential. And so that's the kind of backstory for these images. And I'm as I started to gain momentum with it, I would be able to ask permission. Certain ones are not accessible to the public during these times of day, and I would get permission and find one way or another, legal or questionable, ways to photograph these places. I really thought they looked like the natural landscape in a way. I mean, this image, when I saw it, I was just like, oh, that's Half Dome in Yosemite. You know, the architect who made this had to be thinking about that. And if you notice that in every image where there's a sky, there is some sort of bird. It's either a crow or a seagull, which I was noticing seem to hover around these places. They're scavengers, and they're usually trash cans with, you know, empty pizza boxes and stuff on these skate parks. And so they seem to always be there. So when I was making these Gigapan images, I would start to notice the crows and seagulls, and they would end up in my pictures. But then at some point it became a personal, kind of just a personal impulse of mine that every photograph with a sky would have a bird or more. And so I started collecting images of birds separately from these, and sometimes they would be added in later in the process of my alterations. So I was able to make a book. I got really fortunate. So this is the book that was made with these skate parks, called California Concrete. And there's a long story that goes with that. But in any case, that's that. The skate parks are all included in this book. But the body of work that I exhibited included a second series of these broken ceramics, which just very briefly were made by collecting kind of ceramics from thrift stores and things like that, and I would drop them and break them into pieces and then photograph one particular piece. These are not shot with the Gigapan, these are single images. But there was something when I put them in the studio together, basically the project came about in that in photographing the skate parks, as I was spending time with them, I would think about, like, what are these spaces? You know, they're essentially excavations into the earth and poured concrete. So they're like vessels. They're just complicated. And you know, that led in a long story led to the photographing of these ceramics, where in the breaking of them, there's something about a kind of violence to that, but also creating that sense of dysfunction that I talked about earlier. So the lifeguard tower that's boarded up is dysfunctional. The vessel that's broken is dysfunctional. The skate park that has leaves in a pile becomes a little bit dysfunctional, or water puddles. So these are all this kind of, thread that's coming through the work. The formal relationship between the shapes of these ceramics and the kind of fragility next to the cracks in the concrete of the skate park and the light was all something that just was a very intuitive process in the studio. And I really kind of like those two things butted up to one another. So this is an installation of it. I made a third element of which were these limited edition concrete bowls, which I don't have time to talk about now, but I think I'm going to end it there abruptly and take any and all questions.
Okay, thank you. There are some questions, and some of them seem to perhaps link together. So I'm going to start with a question here that says, can you expand on your interest in fiction? Some photographs feel as though they pose questions, and some feel more akin to storytelling. Please expand.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. So my relationship to fiction is, there's a kind of somewhat difficult line that I'm riding when I'm making work, in that I'm basically completely uninterested in fantasy, meaning like I don't like science fiction. I don't read science fiction. I don't like movies about fantasy. I mean, it's not like it's not a dislike as much as a disinterest. I'm just disinterested in those things. So definitely in the photographs I make, I'm not interested in making something that seems fantastic. It's about more like a sense of alienation or something that is slightly off. I'm definitely interested in a kind of existential quality of being, alone in the landscape, or experiencing I think about times I've taken hikes where I've kind of come around a corner and seen something really strange and been alone experiencing that. That's kind of what I'm thinking about. So the alterations I make are about enhancing that sense of alienation, not so much about creating fantasy. So the other part of what I'll say about that is that my relationship to photography, and I didn't realize this for many years as I was making it, and I say this only because I realize this isn't at all a foregone conclusion. Like, not everybody who makes photographs would say this, but I'm trying to manifest the world that I desire in the pictures. So if it doesn't look like I can imagine that it would look, I'll change something so that it's more akin to my desire, if that makes sense. So the very earnest, approach in a way. I'm not really interested in documenting in such a way that would be traditional documentation, even though I'm kind of coming out of that tradition. But I'm also very self-serving in what I'm trying to accomplish with these kind of images. Hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Another question here. Can you speak further about your process of scouting subjects? What is the process? What are you looking for?
That's a good question. So I've always photographed in a way that I can. I think it actually really goes back to where and how I grew up, in a kind of middle class suburban, not even suburban at the time, it was more rural neighborhood that didn't change much is that I've always felt like I could find a way to make pictures close, meaning that I don't need to go to a faraway land to make the pictures that I want, or have a really expensive, crew or anything like that. There's something about being able to work with what's at hand and what's been dealt. And so I look that way. I look right around, like the lifeguard towers, I moved to an area where I had more access to them, and I started to notice that they were just in the back of my mind. I forgot about them, but then suddenly when I sort of started to observe, I mean, photography is so much about just honing in the skill of observation. So the same with the skate parks, they're from the street level view, people might not even notice them because they're carved into the earth. But having grown up skateboarding, knowing what they would be like from the inside, I kind of felt that they had some sort of potential. So a lot of it is just observing things around me that are close. I use, like I said, for the rocks, I use the internet to help me scout areas. Google Earth is fantastic, but a lot of times it's just observing what's close to me.
All right. In a kind of related question, you seem to spend a lot of time seeking the anomalous. How do you know when the handwork that you've done in post exceeds the nature of the anomaly?
Well, I guess I think I don't fully understand the question, but I'll try. I don't know what exceeding the anomaly means. I mean, I guess there is somewhat of a social aspect to this, which is that, I've always had the fortune of having, colleagues and friends that I show the work to in the process, and I really value feedback. And part of it is sort of testing, my intuition versus what someone will say. Like when I made those cantilevered houses, again, my first instinct was that everyone was going to see them as completely artificial. But the fact is that people didn't see them as artificial, and I took that as a kind of an aha moment where I realized that, photography has such a powerful authenticity attached to it, just by how we've related to it as a culture. Even now, I mean, even in 2020, it still carries a lot of weight in terms of a kind of veracity. And so I use that to my advantage, I guess. I feel like it's to my advantage that I can do things to the image that still maintain a sense of veracity. I definitely don't want the first thing someone says is like, that's fake. Like that would be pretty uninteresting to me. I don't know if that answered your question, actually. That was, I don't really know what you mean by the anomaly, to be perfectly honest, but try.
I don't know the intent of the question, but I think that's a pretty good answer.
Okay, thank you.
We have another one here that says, what do you think the relationship between nature and reality is?
That's cutting to the chase. Okay, well, I think that I clearly have a pretty promiscuous relationship to both of those words. They are I have a very broad definition of nature, is maybe the best way I would put it. I think that living in the technological time that we live in is nature. This is natural. So I use it a lot in air quotes when I think about the difference between the built landscape and the natural landscape, and that's everything in the work is a kind of a moving between the two, where the trees or the rocks can start to look artificial in the right mind frame, and and other things like this concrete formation will look like a mountain. And that's the work. I mean, that is the question: is the relationship between natural and artificial is a very blurry one for me, and ultimately I think there's very little difference.
Okay. There's one more here. You refer to the change of state when you were speaking of wax.
Mm.
And this is not usually a thing associated with photography or with photographs. Can you speak to that?
Well, okay. Meaning that I wish I could ask. I don't really understand the question, to be honest. I mean, I don't know what the change of what change of state is not associated with photography. The fact that photographs are kind of still objects.
I think that might be what they're going for, is that
Okay,
photographs
I'll
kind of
try.
are locked into this. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say something about that wax meditation from Descartes. Is that I remember learning about that as an undergraduate. I minored in philosophy when I was. I didn't mention the part of my biography that I never made art growing up. Nobody in my family was an artist. I came upon it in a really accidental way through philosophy, actually, and that's still a deep interest of mine, of both Eastern and Western contemplative and philosophical ideas. And so I always loved that Descartes story about how he went through this process of sort of contemplating this thing like a candle or wax, and looking at all the properties of such a dumb thing, and how you could take away everything. Okay, the smell goes away, and then the shape goes away when you melt it, and yet it's still wax, and trying to figure out how it is that we know that. And so that body of work with the tree stumps and the trees was just a kind of my riff on that, is that how do you decide that moment that tree is a dead thing and now called a stump, or our bodies for that matter. And so yeah, so and in terms of time, I guess, because the process I'm using in the last several years has been the Gigapan, there is time, expanded sense of time embedded in all of these images. It's latent. It's not an instant. These are 10 minutes or 15 minutes passing, and it's important, even if you can't see it. It informs the way I approach what I'm photographing, and yeah, got there.
All right, I think that's very good. We have some more.
Great, I love it.
It says, likely because of light, landscape, and color, your work exudes a site-specific California essence. How would geography change your work?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of why I wanted to start with a little bit of family history. And I was just thinking about, I texted my brother earlier before this because I was thinking about this talk, and I've been looking through these old slides that my dad thankfully took, thousands of slides that we digitized at one point, and just thinking about how different my life would be if my mom, instead of getting a teaching job in Southern California, got a teaching job somewhere else, in Virginia or in Iowa or Kansas. That would just fundamentally change so much about who I am, and then other things wouldn't change. So, I mean, yeah, it happened naturally. It's not like I was a 25-year-old, grad student, and I thought I'm going to dedicate my life to photographing Southern California. It's more like feeling like I wanted to make work. I'm interested in landscape. I really like to be alone and exploratory and in my work. And so I seek out things like that. And in order to do that consistently, I work with what's at hand. So it's happenstance. I live in California. I grew up in California. I'm sure that my work, I have photographed a few times in other places, and I'm sure if I spent enough time, something would come out of it. It's not like if I lived somewhere else, I would fly to California to make work. That just doesn't seem to fit my personality. So, yeah.
Okay, there's a follow-up to that,
Yeah.
which says, and as a follow-up to my question, do you see yourself being a type of regionalist?
Well, I don't know what yes, in a way. I mean, I think that what I've contributed is it's complicated because I'm coming out of a tradition of both documentary and landscape photography in the kind of art world. But because I'm working with digital technology, there's a kind of glitch in that I'm not sort of purist at all, even though I love a lot of that traditional photography. So, I mean, again, it is where I've spent this much of my career photographing and focusing on. I'm not tied to it in any sense. I have some ideas about photographing in other places, but it is what it is.
Yeah. It always is what it is. You are where you are.
Yeah.
All right. I think we can wrap up the Q&A at this point. And I want to thank everybody for attending and thank you for your interest. I want to thank Amir for joining us. It was quite enlightening. I've been familiar with your work for a while, but I've never heard you speak about it. So I've enjoyed that quite a bit.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's these Zoom lectures are a little odd. You don't get the sense of who's out there, but I appreciate people showing up and listening, and the questions are great.